So the next panel is titled The Evolution of Generative Art. And for that, we have invited Baptiste Crespi, Dr. Lev Manovich, Eliza Struthers-Jobin, correct me if I'm wrong, and then Michael Zankan, who is dialed in online. So basically, a lot of the discussion, I don't know if many of you have actually already taken time to visit the Tezos booth at Grand Palais and what the experience is there, but a lot of the artworks there, pretty much all the artworks there, are focused on generative art as a medium, and as a new genre of art in the digital space and how it relates to blockchain technology. And so we've invited pretty much the experts, the artists, the marketplace creators, the researchers, and more with me on stage to discuss how this art form has developed over time, what it means to us today, and what its role has been in terms of the interplay between art, blockchain, and technology overall. So welcome to everybody here. Thank you so much for joining me. We're going to start with a bit of an introductory question because generative art is a very abstract term. So I'd like to understand what it actually means to each of you. So Eliza, why don't we start with you? What is generative art as you see it?
Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Well, for me, generative art is, any kind of art that is dictated by a process that contains an autonomous kind of element to it. It doesn't have to be anchored in code or a computer. Like, it didn't start off there. But given that these are the tools we have today, now this is where it's come. But yeah, for me, that's the most important element.
For me, it's maybe something I have a lot of control over, and yet brings me a lot of wonder, I'd say.
Hi, good morning. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for Tezos for this fabulous barge. I hope it will, by somehow my miracle, sail away. We can just stay here and talk for a few days, and I don't have to go back to art fair and get a free pass and give it to all my artist friends who kept emailing me for the night and sending me. Anyway, I will wear academic hat to answer this question. So for me, generative art is an art which does use algorithms, and algorithms is not a medium of art, but it's a meta medium, because computer can simulate all the existing media. The computer can be watercolor, oil, photography, and even early generative art. And of course, you can create many new things you couldn't create before. So it's an art created with meta medium of algorithms.
Thank you. And Michael, can you give us your perspective on what generative art is?
I think they said it all. The generative art, the art is in the code, and it's about a process that is not necessarily done by the computer. So nowadays, the tool of the computer is extremely efficient for that task, but it's a common conception that generative art started before computers, and we have the common example of Sol Lewitt, who did processes, and the written instruction on a piece of paper was what he considered to be the artwork, no matter the output.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for the diversity of perspectives on what generative art is as it means to each of you. Obviously, what's brought us all here today is the evolving role of generative art as it relates to blockchain technology. So given the past year or so has been absolutely crucial to the re-emergence of generative art, because I don't want to say it is the emergence, because it is an art form that has existed long before blockchain technology existed. How do you think blockchain has actually brought generative art back into the spotlight?
I guess it comes down to the fact that now there's a financial framework that allows artists to sell their digital work in a meaningful way. And it turns out that generative art is a sub-branch of digital art. And it also turns out that this medium is perfectly fitted to be on blockchain, just because how communities interact and how they enjoy and appropriate collections that are released on chain. And yeah, last year has been quite amazing, and it was maybe last 2 years actually. It has been amazing to see the emergence of generative art and the spotlight it has received. Yeah, I mean, it's been there for a while, and I think some may be more qualified to speak about this, but it's just great to see that now some people are getting proper valuation for the work they're doing.
You're right with the blockchain revolution or evolution have brought digital art into spotlight, but it also changed it completely. So what people mean by digital art today and 3 years ago, it's a very different thing. So while people do get recognition, when I see people who've been working in this field for their whole life, and let's say their work are priced at $10,000 and $50,000, and when people who are 13 or 15-year-old, whose sensations, their work is priced as digital art for $1.5 million, you know, every revolution, you know, some people win and some people, you know, lose. Whether it is French Revolution, Russian Revolution, or blockchain revolution. And the second thing I want to mention, so generative art is as old as contemporary or post-war modern art itself, right? Music with computers begins around 58. The first exhibition of digital algorithmic generative art, if you want, in visual art is 65. You know, in the 60s it was more actually paid more attention by the art world because art world didn't exist. It was more experimental. It was generative itself. Even art world became more conservative about painting, so it kind of went down. So now we have a new period. It's definitely not the last, and we'll see what's going on. But my concern is that, you know, the people who happen to be in the spotlight today, who are 13-year-olds, we're not the only ones who will get evaluations. That it'll be more of a democratic and inclusive process, and people who've been doing it over their lives, and some is people, and also amazing scholars, you know, people like Roger Malina, people who made it all possible for decades are here, and I hope that we all get a bit of a spotlight as well.
So if we basically offer history a bit of value in this conversation, we're watching something evolve through the onset of new technologies. And so how generative art previously existed is not how we perceive it and consume it now. So then to bring that to the artist perspective, so Eliza and Michael, both of you are generative artists and are very actively participating, you know, in incorporating your work into blockchain. How has this conversation impacted you and the work that you've been creating? Eliza, why don't we start with you?
I've been really slow to kind of enter the NFT space because when it kind of exploded in the last 2 years, there was such a mad rush to get on blockchain and to mint. And for me, when that happens, I tend, like if there's a large group that moves towards something, I tend to kind of stand still for a moment to try and like see what's happening, to understand it, because my motivation for creating art was never financial. Obviously, we all want to live comfortably, but initially when I saw everyone just like getting so excited about the numbers, I was like, ugh, because that's not the conversation I want to have about what I'm creating and why. But I think it's amazing, this question of being able to like really claim authorship over what you do in a real way, which we never had before as digital artists. I think a lot of creators didn't feel very legitimate in creating digitally because everyone was just like, oh, it's there, it's on the internet. I could just take a screen capture. Now we know that that conversation has shifted thanks to blockchain, thanks to NFTs. And so now I'm slowly starting to kind of go in and see my comfortable way of doing it. Everyone's different, obviously, in their approach. But so far, the experience has been exceptional.
So it's taking a very experimental approach and making sure that you keep the distinction between the market opportunity and the impact it's actually having on what you choose to create.
Yeah.
And Michael, what about you? How has this impacted your work and how it plays out on Tezos and the work that you mint there?
Oh, it's impacted hugely because discovering that NFTs existed was the moment when I decided to call what I was doing with code art. This is the very moment, because I've been coding for so long. I started at 8 years old. And what I was doing at 8 years old on a language called Logo Turtle was creating graphics with code. It started there. And so I've been coding all my life, and later on I built a company with the aim of making some graphics, animations, and real-time stuff with code and sell it, but the market wasn't really there. So it took a long time before I could sell my work and my creativity, but then again, I wouldn't have called it art. Instead, my need for creating art was released into something that I found more noble, which was painting. So I've been painting with oils, and in the meantime, I was still coding for commission work, but not really as an artist. Sometimes it was being labeled art, but it wasn't until we could have a proper market available for digital art that it made sense to switch to from this label of being just a developer and become an artist. So it changed everything, starting from the moment there was a market for the digital art.
So it offered you a sense of, I guess, legitimacy in your desire to be identified as an artist and basically having the work that you were, spending hours of your day producing to be considered as something as beautiful and not just kind of a piece of technology or an output of code.
Yes, the sense of legitimacy is key here because as a painter, for instance, I didn't attend any school. I didn't have the labels. So the contemporary art world, well, this was my feeling that it was never going to accept me as an artist because I was a self-made. And this is the same with code. I was entirely self-made. There was no school for generative art anyway. So yes, this legitimacy was gained with NFT and with this new market on the blockchain.
And to bring this conversation of legitimacy back to this idea of the market opportunity, so artists, and generative artists in particular, being able to, earn real money off of their work. I mean, Baptiste, the creation of FX Hash as a marketplace, like how have you seen that evolve over time and sort of the appetite, the commercial appetite for generative art grow on there?
I think in the beginning there was this big rush, like everyone was speaking of FX Hash, but I guess it's a bit true for the whole NFT space. Everyone was rushing because we have appetite for money, of course, because money is the lifeblood for existing right now. And so there was a way to share art and gain money. So of course it was very attractive and a lot of people and artists jumped into this. And there were so many wonderful works being released, but also there was this kind of rush and lack of maybe better understanding of the long term and what does it mean to release many collections, what does it mean to not take care of the work we release precisely. And I feel like for the last year, the quality of the work on the platform has increased so much. And I believe this is probably due to people starting to realize, it used to be FX is a little bit Instagram, but you get paid once you release the piece. And it's a bit the same on Niket Nunc or on platform where fees are really low. And people started to realize that this was not enough, you had to make and take care of the things that you release out there. And really, I think it'd be interesting to actually, make a timeline of the work and maybe even like create some sort of process where people could like try to evaluate how much they think the pieces are, finished, polished, and everything, and try to see if there's like a downward trend, upward trend
upwards, yes.
going over time,
Yeah.
But I've noticed this visually, and it was quite great to witnessing suddenly like technically and beautiful and conceptually amazing project being released out of the blue.
And I think also because, for many people who are interacting on the blockchain, people like me who are not particularly experts within the art world, who are learning how to appreciate generative art for its complexity and also sometimes its simplicity is a new challenge because it is very difficult to, value a piece or decide what you'd be willing to pay for something if you've not really been exposed to that artistic discipline before, which is where I want to bring the conversation to more of the academic side of things and like the.
But can I ask you why you keep why you keep calling me academic? My artistic CV has 128 exhibitions, including 7 personal ones, more than all these people combined. I'm an artist. Everybody knows here in the room. So you haven't done your homework.
Well, I would definitely not funnel you down into that, but I do know that.
Sorry, just to give you a hard time because I love you. but anyway, you should also ask me art questions.
Oh no, the hard questions are definitely coming.
Okay.
But what I want to ask is how you've witnessed the rhetoric evolve over time, because obviously you have monitored these spaces over a good chunk of time.
38 years.
Exactly, and you've also done a lot of comprehensive research into the matter. So I think you actually have a level of oversight over how this conversation has evolved over time that many of us who are first dabbling into the space over the last couple of years don't have visibility into. So what I'd like to ask you is, how have you seen that conversation play out? Like, what was this conversation, a few years ago where generative art was sort of a lesser known genre, and how has it played out to now?
Yeah. Well, I want to say that in today digital culture, first of all, I hope don't get upset. I like people, I insult them. It's how I become friends,
I'll take it as a compliment. Thank you.
Some of my sitting audience here, right? But I want to say that, so today's culture, of course, 2 years is like 20 years. Sure. But to bring history very briefly. So as we know, digital art or computer art or generative art, basically until a few years ago, generative was used for design. There was the term generative design. So I was very surprised when people adopted it as an umbrella term for digital art. But why not? Why not? It's not any worse or any better than any other term. So people were doing it in the 60s, 70s, 80s. It was a very small number of people. Of course, in the 60s, it was also Andy Warhol, Robert Rauschenberg, it was a huge thing, but when it went down. And then around 89, 91, we have explosion of so-called new media art, with establishment of institutions like ZKM, Arts Electronica, and we had some curators also in the audience. And new media art really explodes, and it becomes its own field of so-called media art, with its own festivals, its own events, and its own tens of thousands of participants. And it's going on, and becomes very successful. So by 2005, those of us living in North America say we no longer want to use the word term digital art or new media art because it's basically completely everywhere. Little bit we know, but it basically was destined to have another takeoff in the last 2 years. So this is, you can say cycle number 7 or cycle number 70. It's not the last one. So in a few years we'll call something else. But what I want to say is this, and that's very important. Let's face it. We are now entering the crypto art winter. And I'm here referring to history of artificial intelligence, which had its summers, had its springs, had its winters. In the 70s was a winter, in the 90s was a winter. And now in the last year, artificial intelligence is really having artificial intelligence spring. And we saw amazing success of Mid-Journeys and GPT-3, etc. So we're now entering winter. So in a few years, in 2 years, most of those people will be gone. We're not going to have patience to stay. But people who will stay in the space, continue educating themselves, continue doing work, and eating like potatoes, rice, we will emerge victorious. So people who are here for long term will emerge, and people who are fellow travelers will disappear. And that's how culture is. Things go up and down. Careers of artists go up and down. So don't be discouraged by the fact that the NFT market is close to zero now. Something like this will emerge, and I think Tezos is, because you guys are smart and wonderful, and you can take my awful jokes, you'll be here in the long term, and I love you.
And that is precisely why I asked you that question specifically. Thank you very much. And so, to bring this back to this idea of, legitimacy and this idea of crypto winter, and basically, those that are continuing to create at a time where it is quite difficult. And what I want to ask primarily the artists, because I think all of you, as we've just established, all of you here are artists. Generative art had this interesting task of having to legitimize itself recently, because many people who are, involved in the discourse around AI and machine-generated creativity, there is this question of, well, then is it really art if it wasn't created by a human? What is the emotional attachment that we can give this work? And, does it count if it was an automatic instruction if you were just, quote, the coder? So how have you guys navigated this conversation and establishing your legitimacy as artists? Michael, you shared this earlier, but is this a challenge that you still face? Do people still tend to misunderstand the technological component to your work and the creativity it requires to generate that?
Yes, it could be. There could be a shortcut made about generative art, that it's made by a computer, so it's not really human. It's maybe low effort. So we need an entry point for people to understand this is art. And then you get to understand better what is behind the art, what is the process, and how the computers are used to help with this process, and the computer are not the origin of the art. But I think that trying to speak with the commonly appreciated codes about what is art and is a good way to let people enter the artwork, and then you get to explain what is behind that. And I found that printing, for instance, the print, the pink garden monolith that is exhibited at the Tezos booth. Well, I went to the framer with this print, and the framer who sees artworks every day, and he was very interested by the art itself. He said, "Oh, I like this. I've never seen something like that before." So we started to talk, and little by little, I explained to him what was behind. It was created with code. So that was very surprising for somebody who had never heard about generative art. And then we got to speak after a time about the blockchain and how generative art is made out of randomness, and people buy an artwork that they haven't seen yet. So it's a full surprise. And it became absolutely fascinating for that person who is used to see a lot of art. But then when you show a visual that looks like art, then you can have an entry point for the people who are doubtful.
So I guess your experimentation into presenting your art across different mediums, so taking, coded art and bringing it into the physical by having a framed piece, which all of you can actually witness at the Tezos exhibit. If you haven't already gone, I highly encourage it. It's beautiful. It has been a gateway to getting people to start to have this conversation. If their first impression of it is as an art piece, then they are more open to understanding how it was created to begin with, and are unlikely to, I guess, change their opinion after the fact. I mean, Eliza, is this something that you've come across? Because I believe your work is a lot more digitally immersive, or should be consumed in a more digital manner. Is that right?
Yeah, generally I make interactive pieces, and when I describe it to people, usually I say I use code to bend space and time, and that in and of itself sounds like wizardry, and people are very curious about it. And I think also, well, the reaction I get often is, "But you don't look like a coder," which I guess is because I'm a woman. I don't know. That's usually where the conversation ends up. But the people that I speak to, because it's an interactive piece, I guess have more of a context within which to place it as digital art. So for them, it's not such a there's not such a separation between like what is art and like is digital a legitimate platform for art. Yeah.
And Baptiste, what about your own artwork as well, separate from FX Hash? How have you seen that play out in your own pieces?
I mean, I've always used interactivity in my installations to get people engaged in the artwork itself. usually I try to not especially speak about the fact that it's computer generated and everything, and hope that people will discover it through the installation itself. So my work is a lot about creating artificial ecosystem, microcosm, where people can interact using tools, and like scientists will try to deduce behaviors and try to understand the underlying rules of the ecosystem. And only then they start to realize that, wait, 1 second, it's generated and everything. Well, that's at least my hope. I mean, in practice, they see a screen, so they say, oh, it's generated. But ideally, I would like, these people to only after a while start to understand that this is actually code and everything, and then it ticks, and you have this wow effect. And it does the same with Zancan and his species, I believe. This is like the best example that I'm using to introduce people to GenArt, because you show them the drawings and everything, and you suddenly say, it's code, and it's done with math. And they were like, oh, okay, there's the wow effect. And I believe the wow effect also works well because people now are more introduced to computers, and we were born with computers, and as such we have a certain understanding of how computer works and everything, and that what code is a little bit, and this is maybe why it clicks a little bit faster. Mm-hmm. But again, like, this is like a very small field of digital art, and using digital components in the artistic installations. We use mostly screens, but there are also many ways to use code and use autonomous systems to, yeah.
So it basically comes down to how we actually engage the audience or the consumer of the artwork, and then how we actually connect them to the technology to begin with. And Lev, I'd like to ask you about, I think you're about to create the TAEX collection. Can you tell us about that? Because that's brought all of this together into one collection, as it were.
Thank you so much. I wasn't sure if I'm supposed to mention it, but I promised to also explore Tezos platform as well. What I saw at the booth is really exciting. And what I realized, I will answer in a second, what I realized being in the booth is that we can think about generative as the process of art making, but we can also think of generative algorithmic as a process of publishing and perhaps collecting and perhaps art writing. So in a way, it may be interesting to separate these different processes and to think about how generative can play into all of them, right? So you can create traditional artworks, even publish algorithmic, kind of create algorithmic versions in a publishing stage. So I want to thank Dr. Margarita Kuleva, wonderful Russian, American, German scholar and my best friend, who's curated the TAEX platform, a very young startup. So this morning, as of 2 hours ago, we published a series of my images on their platform. And the images were created using Midjourney and Stable Diffusion platform, which I found, like everybody else, I got totally obsessed by them. This summer, I got sucked in. I made 7,000 images in the course of 3 months, and it's not that much. In the series, I posted early versions on Facebook, and I said, what do you think my prompt was? Everybody said it's Bosch. I said, but not only. People said Malevich, Wilson, Rubens. And the prompt was Soviet city designed in the 1960s and painted on large wood panel by Bosch, right? And somehow, from an unconscious, right, of a Midjourney and Stable Diffusion with this amazing database of 5.6 billion image pairs, something came out which impossible to understand. And that's this new, I would say it's yet another kind of generative art when we use these AI platforms. And what's amazing about them, if you let them do what we do, if you don't give them control, if you just say sky, and you get amazing sky. If you say Soviet city painted by Bosch, what does that even mean? I have no idea. So when people think about generative and computer, we think about control, we think about inhuman, we think about cold. In reality, the computers are as unpredictable as human beings, and that's why I love them. And that's why we should embrace them and use them. We can be unpredictable, weird, strange, and totally insane in the most poetic way.
So you've brought up something I definitely want to discuss, which is the emergence of DALL-E and Midjourney as artist creation tools. And what it's enabled people to do is start to experiment with AI generative art and use search terms to try and create interesting and novel pieces. I mean, just as the examples that you've described. So I think in a way that what those platforms have done have acted as a stepping stone or a gateway to understanding how we can interact with, our intent and then the technological output or the visual output, and seeing how code and art can actually coexist in different ways. But do you think that this is going to enable a higher appreciation of coded art, or is it going to present more challenges because now, quote, everybody can do it?
I don't know. For me, what's really interesting about all of this Mid-Journey stuff is the way it changes how we're relating to how we create with the computer. So now it becomes this really interesting game of like, how do you construct the prompt? And there are all of these different theories about the best way to do it to get the best type of output depending on which platform you're using. Is it, there's Mid-Journey, there's DALL-E, there's also Replica, I think it's called. No? Yeah. And so, like, depending on, you could put the same prompt in all three of them and get a completely different output if you tweak it, if you add commas here, are you gonna, and you can throw all of these words together that to us as readers of the English language would sound just like a jumble, but to the computer it actually means something very interesting, which, yeah, like you're saying, for us is unexpected, but for the computer it's like very specific, which is why it's generating that image. So I find that really interesting. Also that you could repeatedly put the same prompt in and still get different visual outputs. So I think it's wonderful if everyone can participate and see what it means for them to interact with the computer and have them think about why why are they choosing these prompts and what does it mean for them to use a machine in this way.
Yeah, and I think it's also the difference between someone who is freely able to play with these tools versus one that actually develops the skill or like the ability to master a tool with so much variability such as this. I mean, Baptiste, have you played with any of these platforms as well, or?
I'd like to. I don't have much time. But
You'll get sucked in, so be careful.
I mean, I've been annoyed to see so many of these outputs of Mid-Journey popping up, although like I quite like the aesthetics and I feel like one of the issues that I have with it is maybe the lack of craftsmanship behind it in a way. I kind of like techno trips like algorithms that are so sophisticated, even if the output is really bad. And I really like this. So that's maybe also why it's so important to me that there's like, I don't know, some hard work or at least like some really well thought process and concept that goes behind producing with text to image softwares. But I'd like to try this, to be fair.
Eliza, would you like to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I don't know that I would believe that the prompt and then the output should be the final product. I've been using it with an artist friend of mine where we'll take images and then, I will add my technique to them and then he will deform the image with his body movement in space and I'll interpret that data in my system. So I don't know if I think it's be it and end all final product, but I do find it really interesting as like an element to add to your practice and play with it and experiment that way.
And just to add to that, it's kind of happening because already some people already wrote plugins for Photoshop and Canva. So in a way, it's already becoming another tool.
Yeah.
So so for some it will be final output, and for another it will be just a step in generation. And I think that's a healthy perspective.
And if you make your own data set, and then you put your prompt in, that's a different story. But I think if you're relying on like a global data set that isn't yours, it's different.
So there's a lot of layers to the sophistication of how this can actually be used as a tool. And also it's the idea of suddenly all of our phones have cameras on them, but that doesn't make us all professional photographers. So the expertise is another dimension to this conversation that we have to acknowledge. Just because we all have it at our disposal, doesn't mean we're all going to naturally be good at it. And I mean, Michael, how have you ventured into this? Have you had a look at Mid-Journey and DALL-E, and have you kind of built your perspective on whether you are pro, anti, or have you tried to experiment in incorporating it into your own work?
No, I haven't at all, because I have been having a sort of allergy to all that is AI. But some artists convinced me that it was not the low effort process that I was thinking about. For instance, I had this conversation with Gambrod, who is a fellow AI artist on Tezos, and he explained to me how much work there was in the process and exploration of these AI tools to come up with a result. And what Elisa said, there is a whole difference between artists who are making their own data set and who have been experimenting for a long time with AI to come up with a process that is really their own and distinguishable. But using those ready-made tools that rely on a huge data set of existing artworks from other artists doesn't seem right to me. But also I have, with my past as an oil painter, I made a lot of friends in the illustration world and other painters and people who have been learning for a long time and practicing huge amount of time to become what would be their daily job, illustration. And they are all so scared of what's coming with AI. So I respect that. And this is why I'm a little bit cautious with AI. But there are some artists that I definitely appreciate.
So a little bit like Eliza's point earlier, where sometimes you see a lot of people rush towards something, so you're taking a bit of a moment to evaluate and see how you'd like to incorporate it, if at all, but you're not necessarily going to jump onto this just for the sake of it because it's there.
Yeah. I mean, to that I would add it this moment with all of the AI stuff is reminding me a lot of when the mad gold rush for NFTs occurred, and I was like, putting my heels into the sand, kind of. And a lot of people who hadn't necessarily coded before just like dove into like all the open source resources and wanted to just grab other people's code to make something and mint it to make a quick buck. And now you're seeing a lot of people who used to freely share their code, and like a lot of the ways that we're learning from each other now as coders, as artists, has changed a lot because people are closing the doors on these things because a lot of people are just trying to grab code and reuse it.
So there's almost an emergence of a defensiveness towards one another.
Yeah, and I find it, I mean, I totally get why it's happening, but I find it a shame because I learned to code, but I started getting into generative art around 2010, 11, and largely because so many people were freely and openly sharing all of their information and being so encouraging online. And now people are a little nervous because there's no credit being given and people are stealing each other's works in a really nasty way. So I get it.
Yeah, it's worrying if we lose that actually, because for me this is one of the best things humanity has built, like open source resources made me. So we must think carefully about maybe putting in place tools and being aware of this defensive mechanism emerging from that what's happening with quick cash grabs maybe.
Exactly.
And it's interesting to consider, to be fair, because we really cannot lose this.
No, it's an integral part of the community. I mean, it's what makes the community, in my opinion. So.
And I think behind that, looking at, the art marketplace, as it were, and Baptiste, to your point earlier, this idea that the way we appraise value for generative art is very different from other art. So, on the one hand, it's the aesthetic beauty, for example, of a Zancan work and how stunning it is framed on a wall, but also to what you were saying earlier, even if the output isn't necessarily pretty or attractive, the sophistication of the code is the thing that made it valuable to you. So how do each of you evaluate generative artwork when you encounter it? I mean, in creating your own collection now, how did you want to demonstrate a sophistication that other people would be able to appreciate openly and readily?
Very good question. And I have a very mixed feeling, right, when I use these tools. Am I allowed to call them my artworks?
Yes.
Or not, right? Because I'm standing right on the shoulders of actually everybody who created, and with 5.6 billion database of images, lots of artists were. At the same time, nobody would exactly create these images like me because nobody exactly has the same kind of cultural database like me. Not many people would think, well, maybe some people would think, but not many people would imagine to combining kind of reference to Soviet kind of utopian or futuristic cyber city planning with 60s and Bosch. But I would say I was trained as a painter since the age of 12. I'm a modernist. That's why I love art fairs, because you go over and you see alternative history more than art. You see artists who were like as amazing as Mondrian, but never made it because he was too close to Mondrian. So if people really want to see the real history of 20th century art, don't go to Pompidou Center, go to the Art Basel, because you see these people who were not included. So I do look at the aesthetics, but I also look at the uniqueness of image. So in my head, I'm trying to have a huge field. Here's all the images humans ever created, all the compositions, all the iconography, etc. And can I make something unique and also something which has the same sensibility as my paintings and drawings which I made in my 10s and 20s. And it's actually very, very hard to bend with AI tools which have their own biases towards a kind of like a concept art, video game, Hollywood aesthetics, to bend them to do something very, very different. But I'm very happy. I'm very kind of happy with this process, precisely because it's very hard. It's like doing etching or engraving. You really have to kind of push the medium to do what you want. Yeah, so algorithm resists.
Yeah, I think it's very much opened up the conversation of how we choose to critique art nowadays and where we derive value and what sort of emotional connection that we have to these pieces as well, because a large part of experiencing art is an emotional connection to what you're witnessing. And so what that looks like, where you derive value from an art piece is going to be, I think, forever in flux. It's not necessarily just confined to generative art as a relatively recent art medium.
I want to literally take 20 seconds. As I said, when we're talking about emotions and soft, and saying algorithms are cold and how people are going to like it, but we're so wrong, because if you go to art fair, you're going to see Bazzarelli and Malevich and Mondrian, and the whole 20th century art was about dehumanizing human, right? Creating abstract art, creating geometric art, creating the human art, breaking the human in cubism, creating this kind of cyborgs in 1920s, German art. So this idea that art is fuzzy and soft, and algorithmic art is cold, that's a very historical perspective. Modern art was about cold. It was about dehumanizing. So if we're now saying, oh, the art is soft, we're being very historical. So that thing makes me nervous.
And I mean, we've only got 3 minutes left on the clock, so I'd like to invite, each of you to add to that point, or we can open up the floor to questions, because I have a feeling that we might have a few out there. And with that, we'll open it up to the audience. Are there any questions? Yes, out in the front. Yes. Can you please use the microphone? Thank you.
Hi, I've got a question to Baptiste maybe. To me, generative art is really a combination between code and visuals. You were talking about how you appreciate the sophistication of the code. At what level do you think we need to have collectors also understand how the generative art is made, instead of only looking at the visuals? And I mean collectors that are not really used to collect generative art.
I believe what's really important is to have the resources available for collectors to be able to learn more about generative art and the pieces they like or may like, if they want to. Because, some collectors will never want to dive into this and just have an appreciation of the visual itself and really don't care about the code. And I really think that if resources are there and made available quite easily, it may improve, the knowledge, the overall knowledge of the collector community. And that's basically was the main vector for building FX Text. So it's an article system where people can write about some pieces, and it's directly displayed on the piece itself. So right now, it's getting a little bit easier if you want to understand a bit more about a piece and the processes behind it, to just go on the piece itself and read what people have been writing about. But it's an ongoing process, of course. It's about providing tools and hoping that eventually there will be these resources being built.
We actually only have 1 minute left on the clock, so I'll allow for one more question. And I believe the gentleman at the back had one at the very beginning, so we'll offer it to them. Or lady, I can't
I'll
see.
make it short so the other person can also. So, unfortunately, you've made me think. I work with colleagues in China that organize the annual art exhibition in China, the Biennale. And they actually use AI algorithms to select which artists to show. Initially, I thought this is a terrible idea, algorithmic curating. But then they said, you know, we can put in the biases we want to put in, whereas a curator, you don't know what biases they have. And so, no, I mean, the easy one is they make sure that the artists in the exhibition come from all over China, not from Paris, I mean Beijing. So that they put into the algorithm the biases intentionally. Equal men and women. In China, they don't have gay people. Yeah, no, well, okay, that's not funny. I'm sorry, I withdraw that. But in fact, algorithmic curating is now beginning. And maybe it's dangerous, maybe it could be liberating to know what biases you put into the algorithm.
Any comments on the floor?
Replace the curators.
I mean, I don't know. I find it a curious idea to consciously apply biases. It's an interesting conversation to start to think about. I'd never considered that.
I mean, it adds to
Often
to the entire blockchain argument of total transparency.
Exactly.
So I guess it lends itself quite tidily there. I mean, we're actually out of time, unfortunately, and I think this is one of the kind of conversations that will exist in perpetuity. And I'm sure, you know, we're all going to be sat down together again at some point in the future to talk about where we've gone to next. So, I mean, Michael Zancan, Dr. Levmanovic, Baptiste Cressy, Eliza Struthers-Jobin, thank you so much for all of your perspectives. It's been absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you.